In an Argentina plunged into uncertainty and on the verge of hyperinflation, a man emerges as an unexpected protagonist with a strength capable of defying all kinds of political expectations. Two bushy sideburns and long hair framed the strong-featured face that captivated millions of Argentinians. Carlos Saúl Menem, a man with a magnetic personality, who not only redefined the course of Argentina, but also unleashed a torrent of ambitious transformations, who inherited a historical legacy that endures to this day. Today we will learn about the biography of a Peronist leader who became one of the main figures of liberal politics in the region. My name is Alejandro Andrade. This is the New Encyclopedia, We invite you to follow us on our social media so you don't miss more videos like this one. Without further ado, let's begin with the biography of Carlos Menem. Carlos Saúl Menem was born on July 2, 1930 in Anelaco, a small agricultural town in the north of La Rioja province. In Argentina, he was the first son of Saúl Menem and Moive, two Syrian immigrants who, like so many others, came to Argentina escaping the war. The childhood of young Menem was like that of any provincial child. From a very young age, he lived in community with his neighbors, and he was guided by his family to help with the chores of the family business, a prosperous grocery and service store. He attends elementary school at a co-ed school, where some of his classmates would describe him as a mischievous and cheerful boy. Menem's parents instilled Islam in him, although not strictly, and despite his Muslim upbringing, Menem felt a special attraction to the Catholic faith from an early age. Young Menem would not be the only convert to Catholicism in his household. Later, his own mother would join him as she began to feel a devotion to the Virgin Mary. This devotion would intensify due to a unique experience during childbirth, where she had a Marian vision when she fainted. During his adolescence, the multifaceted personality of Menem began to emerge strongly. During this stage, he began to develop a great interest in sports, with basketball, soccer, and boxing being his favorite sports. At the same time, he got involved in amateur theater, standing out as a leading actor in various plays. This showed his first signs of a future attraction to public life. By 1945, in the middle of a lively and carefree adolescence in the province, Argentina was not immune to the events and political changes of the time. While World War II was coming to an end in Europe, a national and popular movement began to rise in Argentina, led by then Colonel Juan Domingo Perón. He would completely change the course of Argentine history, as well as the history of the young Menem, who was a high school student and maintained an active social life. At 16 years old, the rise of the Peronist movement awakened in him a strong sense of nationalism and interest in the history of Argentina. At this stage, he began his first readings with a particular interest in the caudillos. Here, Menem develops an idolatry that some have described as obsessive for the figure of Facundo Quiroga, a prominent military leader and caudillo of the 19th century. The figure of the caudillo resonated in Menem's mind as a role model to follow, even leading him to want to emulate Quiroga's physical appearance. From then on, Menem let his hair and sideburns grow, which years later would become his distinctive feature. At 18 years old, Carlos Menem began to read the Bible with devotion and to get actively involved in the local Catholic Church. These actions caused differences with his Muslim father. In 1949, at 19 years old, he graduated from high school and made the decision to leave his home in La Rioja behind, to study law at the National University of Córdoba. The economic situation in his family was no longer the same as in his childhood, and the now adult Menem had to fend for himself. Once at the university, Menem quickly fit in, making new friends and joining his faculty's basketball team. And in addition, he started to frequent the university bar, where he was popular for his ability to have long conversations about the leader, Quiroga. He divided his time between nightlife, sports, his studies, and another of his new passions, women. At 21, Menem has his first direct contact with Peronism thanks to basketball. It was 1951, and the Peronist movement was living its golden age in Argentina, where General Perón's charisma and the extensive welfare state were able to stir up fervent passions among the masses. That year, his team won one of the well-known Evita Championships, where he received the Great Award from none other than President Juan Domingo Perón and his wife, Eva. At the age of 25, Menem managed to pass all his subjects and graduated as a lawyer, so he decided to return to La Rioja with his degree. However, months later, in 1955, General Perón was overthrown in a violent coup d'etat. And once again, the political course of Argentina changed with the beginning of a new military dictatorship. Although Menem's nationalism had never been tinged with any political color, the bloody coup d'etat of 1955 caused him so much outrage that he sided with Perón's government. But once Juan Domingo Perón was overthrown and the new de facto government was consolidated, the now lawyer Carlos Menem became a fervent legal defender of political prisoners. However, shortly after, he was temporarily detained in 1956 after being accused of participating in a conspiracy against the government. It was after these dramatic events that Menem, at 26 years old, sealed his support for the Peronist cause and devoted his life to politics, the great passion that would drive him until his last breath. In 1957, he secretly founded the Peronist Youth of La Rioja, and alongside his work as a lawyer, he actively participates in regional politics and gains some recognition among the Peronists, even though it was banned at the time. After the passing of the years and due to apparent coincidences of fate, in 1966, Menem managed to visit Juan Domingo Perón during his exile in Spain after being referred and invited by a mutual friend of the leader of justicialism. That same year, he made a trip to Syria where he met Zulema Fatima Yoma, who was also Muslim and from La Rioja, and whom he would marry 2 years later. In 1966, Argentina was shaken once again by a coup d'etat in 1966, this time against the constitutional government of Arturo Humberto Illia from the Radical Civic Union Party, which once again started a military dictatorship. This new period was characterized by high political and social conflict and the rise of guerrilla organizations, and the specter of an imminent return of Peronism to power, which was still banned from political life. In 1973, after an entire period had passed, the military dictatorship allowed presidential elections to be held and authorized the participation of Peronism. Although Juan Domingo Perón's candidacy was banned, in the midst of this atmosphere of social unrest and elections, Menem focused on the land where he grew up and where he was already known. He was a leading figure in Peronist politics, thus running as a candidate for the governorship of La Rioja for the justicialist movement. The flamboyant nature of Menem's personal life was also reflected in his role as a candidate for governor, carrying out a personalist and populist campaign. The media quickly began drawing comparisons between him and his admired leader Facundo Quiroga, with this resemblance becoming his most distinctive trait for the voters of La Rioja. For these crucial elections, Peronism formed the Justicialist Liberation Front at the national level, supporting the presidential candidacy of Héctor José Cámpora. With the promise of the long-awaited return of Peronism to power, with the chant "Campora to the government, Peron to power." Peronism. It triumphed in the 1973 elections, bringing Hector Campora to the presidency with almost 50% of the votes. On the other hand, in the provincial elections of La Rioja, Menem is elected with an overwhelming 57% of the votes. At 43 years old, he became the new governor-elect of the province, a position he would hold until 1976. Amid the turbulent national context, with Peron's return to the presidency and his subsequent death, Menem's administration achieved significant progress, earning him considerable popularity as governor. He wasn't shy in front of the press, and whenever he could, he would appear at shows, soccer matches, and anywhere the cameras were present. In his personal life, Carlos Menem's marriage went through ups and downs, and he devoted part of his time to raising his children, Carlos Jr., who was 5 years old, and Zulamita, who was 3. According to his wife's own testimony, during this period as governor, Menem developed an uncontrollable passion for the figure of Quiroga. This passion intensified over time and allegedly even took on a mystical character. Believing himself to be a kind of reincarnation of this leader, his wife even claimed that Governor Menem had episodes where he would take long rides on horseback through the hills of La Rioja in the early hours of the morning, just like his leader Quiroga. Like all elected officials in 1973, Menem was unable to complete his term as governor. In 1976, a coup d'état once again removed the Justicialist Party from power and established a civic-military dictatorship that would become known as the National Reorganization Process. Led by the military officers Jorge Rafael Videla, Emilio Eduardo Macera, and Orlando Ramon Agosti. As a result, Menem is arrested by armed forces officials in the early hours of the coup. After more than 2 years in detention, Carlos Menem is finally released on parole in July 1978. However, he is forbidden from returning to his province to prevent his political activity. Menem would not participate in national politics until 5 years later, with the return to democracy. In 1983, at the age of 53, he returned to his homeland to run again for governor, achieving an overwhelming victory with more than 56% of the votes. At the same time, the Radical Civic Union triumphed in the presidential elections, with its brand new candidate Raúl Alfonsín obtaining more than 50% of the votes. Alfonsín's government in Argentina faced a severe crisis marked by excessive foreign debt, high inflation on the verge of becoming hyperinflation, and a plummeting gross domestic product. This scenario, along with his well-regarded performance as a governor not belonging to the ruling party, allowed Menem to catapult himself politically, running for re-election and obtaining more than 60% of the votes in the provincial elections of 1987. Being a popular governor with a flawless election record allowed Menem to gain a certain prominence and power within the Justicialist Party at the national level, where his name was part of a wing focused on renewal and democratization within the party. In the absence of a personalized leadership like Perón's by 1988, Peronism held the first presidential primary in its history, in which the successful Governor Menem decided to compete in what would be his most ambitious political venture up to that point. To the surprise of many, Menem achieved a comfortable victory in the party primaries and became the new undisputed leader of the Peronist movement. Meanwhile, Alfonsín's government, faced with an increasingly critical economic crisis and growing instability, decided to move the presidential elections up to May of 1989. The main political forces quickly prepared their machinery and supporters for a decisive national election. Under catchy slogans, catchy songs, and an interesting convergence between show business and politics. Menem seeks to charm the masses dissatisfied with radicalism, and he appeals to the nostalgia of the golden era of the years of Juan Domingo Perón. To attract the justicialist electorate, Menem's proposals never strayed from the popular policies of Peronism, even going so far as to promise a productive renewal and a major wage increase for crisis-stricken Argentina. And although the official candidate was doing much better than expected for a government with a negative economic record, his campaign was not enough to stop the inevitable result. Peronism, led by the flamboyant Carlos Menem. He achieved an overwhelming victory, getting more than 47% of the votes, surpassing the official candidate by more than 10 points. In this way, the Peronist with the bushy sideburns and thick hair becomes the new president of the Argentine Republic. On July 8, 1989, Carlos Saúl Menem takes office as president in a climate of great expectations and receives the presidential sash from former President Raúl Alfonsín. The new government inherits an Argentina plagued by inflation and deep economic recession, so Carlos Menem takes office with the obligation to face great challenges. Once in power, contrary to what was expected from a leader of the Peronist movement, the new president Carlos Menem pours cold water on the heat of the post-election honeymoon, and he commits to implementing a plan of structural reforms with a liberal approach. This government plan involved reducing public spending, opening up the economy, deregulating trade, and liberalizing finance. This plan was designed following the guidelines of the Washington Consensus precisely, a set of economic policies recommended by prominent American economists for developing countries. In his inauguration speech, Menem declares that Argentina is a broken country sunk in a terminal crisis. And to get out of that situation, he warns Argentinians that a tough, costly, and severe adjustment will have to be made to the economy. To that end, men of the most diverse viewpoints make up Menem's government in what he called a government of national unity, which unites the two Argentinas, that of Rosas and Sarmiento, of Mitre and Facundo, and of Perón and Balvin. It was the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the arrival of a new unipolar liberal order, and Menem, pragmatic like General Perón and bold like the caudillo, Quiroga. He understands that the world divided into two poles had come to an end, and decides to do what many others did, bet on the winner. But this shift was not limited to the economic sphere. Between 1989 and 1990, Menem pardons numerous civilians and military personnel who committed crimes during the military dictatorship, the same dictatorship that imprisoned him for his Peronist activism. The main leaders of this period, such as Jorge Rafael Videla and Emilio Eduardo Matzera, were also pardoned by the president. After an alarming 2,000% annual inflation in 1990, which meant an entry into official hyperinflation, the set of liberal measures was radicalized in 1991, and an aggressive privatization plan was launched, which included practically all the companies that had been state-owned since the time of Perón. This aggressive opening promoted a massive influx of foreign investment and imports of all kinds of products, which together with the increase in interest rates set in motion a silent process of deindustrialization in Argentina. By April of 1991, one of the most ambitious economic proposals of President Menem and his new Minister of Economy, Domingo Cavallo, is established. This is the convertibility law of the Austral, or what is popularly known as the one-to-one. This was a monetary law that established a fixed equivalence between the Argentine peso and the United States dollar. This meant that not a single peso could be issued unless a dollar came in to back it. At the Central Bank of Argentina, in the short term, the convertibility turns out to be a resounding success. Hyperinflation is stopped in its tracks. The middle and upper classes of Argentina regain their ability to save, and the working classes no longer see their wages disappear in just a few days. The problem with this model is that it was highly dependent on the inflow of dollars, which created a lot of rigidity in the economy, and Argentina loses the ability to adjust its currency to adapt to economic changes. However, this was during the era of rapid privatization of state-owned companies and of the massive influx of investments. So the consequences of this ambitious economic policy would not be seen until much later. In the severe financial crisis of the late 1990s and early 2000s. However, as 1991 ends, the Menem government has accomplished significant feats. Hyperinflation has completely disappeared. Gross domestic product is growing at 9%. And in just over 2 years in power, everything seems to be going wonderfully in the economy. Menem continues and strengthens his alignment with Washington and turns Argentina into an important ally outside of NATO. Between 1989 and 1990, the government reestablishes diplomatic relations with the United Kingdom, which had previously been interrupted since the Falklands War. In what is known as the Madrid Treaty, multiple agreements are made that mark the formal end of hostilities with the United Kingdom. The mutual renunciation of claims due to the war and the obligation to resolve disputes by peaceful means. Permission is also granted for British participation in economic sectors of high strategic importance. And in 1994, President Menem abolished compulsory military service in Argentina by decree. In the years following convertibility, liberal-style reforms were maintained and even intensified. Public services, a large part of the railway networks, and Argentina's major oil company were privatized. The Argentine airline companies were also privatized. The state gas company, and even part of the television channels. Argentina is going through an aggressive privatization process where more than 400 companies are being sold below their real value, leaving a large part of their workers unemployed. At that time, the current constitution of Argentina still prevented immediate presidential re-election. So Menem, at the height of his popularity in 1994, reached an agreement with the opposition led by the radicals and former President Alfonsín. This way, he began a broad constitutional reform and continued his path of structural changes. And would this reform clear the way for Carlos Menem to continue his government? Well, from a 6-year presidential term with no possibility of immediate re-election, now it would change to a 4-year term with the possibility of being re-elected as president, leaving the door open for his long-awaited re-election, which by then was already being talked about in the public sphere as something indisputable. On the other hand, Menem's economic plan begins to show considerable side effects. The unemployment rate increases constantly and at a dizzying pace starting in 1992, reaching a peak of 18.4% by 1995. Although liberalization achieved remarkable results in certain statistics, the worsening of the general conditions of the labor market was becoming an undeniable reality. Between 1992 and 1995, a minority sector of the population felt discontent, led to the first strikes against the Menem government, led by labor unions. But despite high unemployment, an excessive increase in foreign debt to maintain convertibility, and a growing discontent among orthodox sectors of Peronism, the effects of the end of inflation and economic growth, it resonated more strongly with the population than any other problem that wasn't tangible at the time. In a paradoxical scenario for a movement like Peronism, The comfortable context for the middle and upper classes meant that President Menem enjoyed high levels of popularity among these groups. It was the golden age of television, show business, and massive events in Argentina. In line with his nature, the president broke all the traditional parameters of politics by not refusing to engage with show business. He took part in high-rating television shows, made public appearances, drove a luxurious Ferrari, welcomed the Rolling Stones at the Olivos presidential residence, and even danced tango with the First Lady of the United States at the White House. But despite this atmosphere of optimism for the future, his term is also remembered for two dark episodes. These were the terrorist attacks of the 1990s. In 1992, the Israeli embassy was the target of an attack that left 22 dead. And in 1994, a Jewish community center known as Asociación Mutual Israelita Argentina was attacked by a car bomb, resulting in the death of 85 people. The investigation of the first attack never went to trial, while the trial of the second case revealed a cover-up network that involved several important figures, including the president himself. Menem, however, another tragic event shocks the life of Carlos Menem, but not as a president, rather as a father. In 1995, he receives the news that his son, Carlos Menem Jr., dies during a helicopter trip at 26 years old. Although the experts determined that it was an accident, multiple theories arose about it, where even his mother, Zulema, claimed that it was an organized event. Faced with a justicialist party led by Carlos Menem and a radical party overshadowed by the success of liberal measures, the bipartisan structure between Peronists and radicals in Argentina was broken. The absence of a platform that defends the values traditionally upheld by Peronism led to the creation of a new political front for the 1995 presidential elections. The discontented Peronism, social democracy, Christian democracy, and even minority sectors of communism come together to form what is known as the Solidarity Country Front. In this way, they try to defeat Carlos Menem in the upcoming presidential elections. However, by that time, Menem's successes were far more numerous than the discontent with the new economic model. Menem thus achieves an overwhelming victory with almost 50% of the votes and more than 20 points ahead of the most voted opposition candidate, José Octavio Bordón, who was a former member of the same justicialist party. In this way, in just one presidential term, Menem revolutionized the national political landscape. Menem's second government would be defined by one main characteristic: the exhaustion of the economic model. Although convertibility was still fulfilling its main purpose of stabilizing the value of the peso, the Argentine state did not always have the same flow of capital that allowed it to have enough dollars to back each peso issued, so the government began to resort to debt. Just 1 year later, in 1996, Menemism began to falter internally. The hardest blow it received was the departure of the father of convertibility, the Minister of Economy, Domingo Cavallo. And with his departure, all the problems behind the system began to surface. The debt had grown exponentially, going from $61 billion in 1992 to $124 billion in 1997. Popular discontent over economic stagnation and major corruption scandals soon began to show at the polls. In 1997, legislative elections were held in Argentina, and Carlos Menem lost the winning streak that had characterized him. With a turnout of almost 80% of the electoral roll, Menemism was decisively defeated by more than 10 points. Another factor that contributed to dampening popular enthusiasm for the major economic transformations was the constitutional impossibility of serving a third presidential term and since the law forced him to step aside. The leadership of the Justicialist Party falls to Eduardo Duhalde, who had been Menem's vice president during his first administration. However, the decline in the ruling party's popularity was already irreversible. In the presidential elections of 1999, the Justicialist Party suffered a historic defeat, and the Radical Civic Union returned to power with more than a 10-point lead. On December 10, 1999, after a long decade of major transformations, Carlos Menem handed over the presidential sash. The new president, Fernando de la Rúa, inherited an Argentina with a stable currency and no inflation, but on the other hand, with an economy deeply in debt that threatened to explode at any moment. When he left the presidency in 1999, Menem temporarily withdrew from the public scene. But in 2001, he returned to entertainment magazine covers. At the age of 70, he got married again to a Miss Universe named Cecilia Bocono, with whom he had a son. In June of that same year, Menem was arrested for his alleged involvement in arms smuggling during his term. This was the first time that a former Democratic president was arrested in Argentina. Shortly after, he was released by the courts, and with the entire national press watching him, he took the opportunity to announce the unexpected. Menem confirmed his third candidacy for the 2003 presidential elections. However, the country already had other concerns different from those of the 90s. The influx of foreign currency provided by the privatization of state-owned companies had dried up, and the state was running out of money to maintain convertibility. And faced with investors' distrust, there was a massive capital flight. The one-to-one exchange rate was no longer sustainable, and Argentinians, fearing the worst, began to withdraw large sums of money from their bank accounts. The seeds sown during the Menem decade bore fruit in 2001 when the government of Fernando de la Rúa enacted a set of measures popularly known as the Corralito, restricting the free withdrawal of cash from fixed-term deposits, checking accounts, and savings accounts. Among other measures, the then Minister of Labor, Patricia Bullrich, signed a decree establishing a pay cut for public sector workers and for retirees. And in response to these measures, Argentinians protest in the main cities of the country. With the cry of, "They all must go," large protests break out, resulting in looting and destruction. In response to this, President de la Rúa resigns from the presidency and leaves the Casa Rosada by helicopter, leaving the country in the midst of uncertainty. As time passes, the 2003 presidential elections arrive, and the popular slogan, "They all must go," is reflected in the electoral arena. In the first round, the radicals receive only 2% of the votes, while within Peronism, two major forces emerge. On one side, former President Menem gets 24% of the votes, and on the other, representing the Peronists dissatisfied with Menem, Nestor Kirchner achieves an unexpected 22%. For the second round, many opinion polls showed Nestor Kirchner as the absolute winner of the presidential election. Therefore, in what seemed like a strategy to avoid defeat, Menem withdrew from the second round just 4 days before it was to take place. In this way, Nestor Kirchner became the new president of all Argentinians, thus marking the beginning of the Kirchnerist movement, which remains relevant in Argentine politics to this day. At almost 80 years old, Menem's time as a presidential politician was coming to an end. However, he would still have a few more years in Argentine politics. In 2005, he ran for and was elected as a national senator for La Rioja, a position he would hold until his death. During these years, his political figure was marked by multiple judicial charges, as well as by 2 highly significant votes in the Senate. The first was when he rejected the tax withholdings on agriculture proposed by President Kirchner in 2008, and the second was when he voted against the decriminalization of abortion in 2018. After years of battling various illnesses, Carlos Saul Menem passed away on February 14, 2021 at the age of 90. His life was a spectacle of lights and shadows that goes beyond that of a simple political figure. He had 2 presidencies, 2 governorships, political persecutions, corruption scandals, and an intense chapter of great transformations that still resonates in the collective memory of Argentina. Thank you very much for watching the video until the end. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes like this one. And if you liked the video, leave a like and share your opinions in the comment section. Also remember to follow us on our social media to stay up to date with the latest news from the channel. Without anything else to add, see you next time. May God bless you all.